Christian Helen was dying and she knew it. The doctors had given her 6 months to live, but that didn't scare her anymore. What scared her was dying without anyone holding her hand. What broke her heart was knowing she had millions of dollars but not a single person who loved her for who she really was. On the morning of her 60th birthday, she woke up alone in her giant mansion, wondering if anyone in the world would even remember. Her children had forgotten her birthday. Her sister never called anymore. But then, something unexpected happened. A young homeless boy knocked on her door and everything changed. Hello friends. Welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? New York? United Kingdom? Maybe South Africa or Jamaica? We want to know. The sun rose over the city, painting the sky orange and pink. Christian Helen's mansion stood tall on Maple Street, surrounded by iron gates and beautiful gardens. From the outside it looked like a palace. Inside it felt like a prison. Helen sat in her bedroom looking at herself in the mirror. Her hands shook as she tried to button her blue dress. The sickness made everything harder now. She was thin, too thin. Her silver hair, once thick and beautiful, now hung loose around her pale face. The doctors had told her the truth 3 months ago. 6 months to live. Maybe less. But Helen wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of dying alone. She walked slowly down the grand staircase, holding tight to the railing. Each step hurt. Her legs felt weak. Her chest felt tight. But she kept going. Today was her birthday. Surely someone would remember. Surely someone would come. The mansion was huge. 15 rooms. A swimming pool in the back. A garage with 3 expensive cars. Paintings on the walls worth thousands of dollars. Chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. Everything perfect. Everything expensive. Everything empty. Helen had worked her whole life to build her business. She started with nothing and became one of the richest women in the city. She sold luxury furniture to rich people all over the country. She made smart deals. She never gave up. And she became a millionaire before she turned 40. She did it all for her family. For her 2 children, Janet and Jacob. She wanted to give them the best life possible. The best schools. The best clothes. The best future. But somewhere along the way something went wrong. Janet, her 35-year-old daughter, used to call every day when she was younger. "Mommy, I love you," she would say. "You're the best mom in the world." But now, Janet only called when she needed money. For a new car. For a vacation. For designer bags and shoes. She lived across town but visited maybe once a month. And when she did visit, she spent the whole time on her phone, barely looking at her mother. Jacob, her 32-year-old son, was even worse. He took money from Helen's business account without asking. He threw parties with his friends and spent thousands of dollars in one night. When Helen tried to talk to him about it, he would get angry. "It's my inheritance anyway," he would say coldly. "Why do I have to wait until you're dead to enjoy it?" Those words had cut Helen deeper than any knife. Then there was Vivian, Helen's younger sister. They grew up poor together, sharing one small room, one old blanket, dreaming of better days. When Helen became successful, she helped Vivian. She paid for Vivian's house. She gave her money every month. She thought sisters were supposed to stick together forever. But Vivian became jealous. She wanted more. She wanted what Helen had. And slowly, she stopped being a sister and became a stranger who only smiled when she wanted something. Helen reached the bottom of the stairs and walked into the dining room. Mrs. Anderson, her cook, had prepared a small birthday cake earlier that morning. It sat on the long table looking lonely. 60 candles ready to be lit. But no one to light them. Helen picked up her phone and checked her messages. Nothing from Janet. Nothing from Jacob. Nothing from Vivian. She had sent them all reminders yesterday. "Tomorrow is my 60th birthday. I would love to see you. Please come celebrate with me." No one replied. Helen felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to cry. She had cried enough in the past few months. Cried when the doctor gave her the bad news. Cried when her children forgot her last birthday. Cried when she realized that all her money couldn't buy the one thing she desperately wanted: love. She walked to the big window in the living room and looked outside. The street was busy. People walking to work. Children riding bicycles. A mother holding her baby. Everyone looked happy. Everyone had someone. Helen pressed her hand against the cool glass and whispered to herself, "I have millions of dollars. I have everything. So why do I feel like I have nothing?" The morning turned into afternoon. The house stayed quiet. Helen sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window, and watched the world go by. She felt the sickness pulling at her, making her tired. But she didn't want to sleep. If she slept, she might miss someone coming. She might miss a call. She might miss the chance to not be alone. At 2 o'clock, she heard footsteps outside. Her heart jumped. She sat up straight. Was it Janet? Was it Jacob? Were they finally here? But the footsteps passed by. Just the delivery man dropping off a package next door. Helen's heart sank again. By 3 o'clock, the sun was burning hot outside. Helen felt weak. She wanted to eat something, but she had no appetite. She wanted to call someone, but who would answer? She wanted to cry, but she had no tears left. Then, through the window, she saw him. A small boy walking slowly down the street. His clothes were torn and dirty. His feet were bare, covered in dust and cuts. His face was thin, too thin, like he hadn't eaten in days. He couldn't have been more than 11 years old. The boy stopped in front of Helen's gate. He looked up at the big mansion, his eyes wide with wonder and fear. He stood there for a long time as if trying to gather courage. Then, slowly, he pushed open the gate and started walking up the long driveway toward the house. Helen watched him, her heart beating faster. Something about this boy touched her soul. Maybe it was the way he walked, so carefully, so humbly. Maybe it was the sadness in his young eyes. Or maybe it was because, at that moment, Helen saw herself in him. Alone. Hungry. Desperate for kindness. The doorbell rang. Helen stood up, her legs shaking. She walked to the door and opened it. There he was. The poor street boy, looking up at her with eyes that held both hope and shame. His lips were cracked. His hands were dirty. His stomach was probably empty. "Please, ma'am," he said in a voice so soft she almost didn't hear it. "I'm very, very hungry. Could you please give me some food? Just a little bit. Anything. Even leftovers would be okay." Helen looked at this boy, this stranger who had the courage to ask for help. And something inside her broke open. Not with sadness this time, but with purpose. For the first time all day she smiled. A real smile. "What's your name, child?" she asked gently. "Francis, ma'am," the boy replied, looking down at his dirty feet. Helen's smile grew bigger. "Well, Francis, today is my birthday. And you know what? You're the first person to show up. So you won't eat scraps from my kitchen. You'll sit at my table like a guest of honor. Come inside." Francis looked up at her, shocked. "Really, ma'am? You mean it?" "I mean it," Helen said, opening the door wide. "Come in, Francis. Let's celebrate together." And that's how it began. A millionaire woman dying alone. A street boy starving for food. Two people who had nothing in common except loneliness. Neither of them knew it yet, but this meeting would change everything. This birthday would become the most important day of both their lives. Francis stood frozen at the doorway, his bare feet on the edge of the expensive marble floor. He had never seen anything like this in his entire life. The floor was so shiny he could see his dirty reflection staring back at him. A huge chandelier hung from the ceiling, sparkling like 1,000 stars. The furniture looked softer than any bed he'd ever slept on. "Come on in, don't be shy," Helen said warmly, noticing how scared he looked. "But ma'am," Francis whispered, looking down at his filthy feet. "I'm too dirty. I'll mess up your beautiful house." Helen's heart melted even more. This boy who had nothing was worried about ruining her things. Her own children, who had everything, never cared about anything she owned. They broke things, stained things, and never even said sorry. "Francis, listen to me," Helen said, bending down a little to look him in the eyes. "You are a guest in my home. Guests are always welcome, no matter what they look like. Now come inside before I change my mind about that chocolate cake in the kitchen." "Chocolate cake?" Francis's eyes went wide. He couldn't remember the last time he had cake. Maybe when he was 5 years old, before his parents died. That felt like a lifetime ago. Slowly, carefully, Francis stepped inside. He tried to walk on his tiptoes so his dirty feet wouldn't touch too much of the floor. Helen watched him and smiled sadly. When was the last time someone showed such respect in her home? "Wait here," Helen said, and she disappeared down a hallway. Francis stood in the entrance, looking around in amazement. There were paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in museums. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor like something from a fairy tale. Through a doorway he could see a dining room with a table so long it could seat 20 people. Helen returned carrying a bowl of warm water, a towel, and some soap. "Before we eat, let's get you cleaned up a bit," she said kindly. "Sit down on that chair there." Francis sat down nervously on the edge of a fancy chair, trying not to touch too much of it. Helen knelt down in front of him, something that shocked Francis so much he almost jumped up. "Ma'am? No. You shouldn't kneel for me," Francis said, his voice full of panic. "I'm nobody. I'm just a street boy." "Everybody is somebody, Francis," Helen said softly. She began washing his feet gently with the warm water. "In this house on my birthday, you are my honored guest." Tears filled Francis's eyes. Nobody had touched him with kindness like this in years. Most people looked at him with disgust. They shooed him away like he was a rat. They called him names. Beggar. Trash. But this rich woman in her beautiful mansion was washing his feet like he was a prince. "Why are you being so nice to me?" Francis asked, his voice cracking. Helen looked up at him and Francis saw tears in her eyes too. "Because today I learned something, Francis. I learned that kindness doesn't come from family or money. It comes from the heart. And you, my dear boy, had the courage to ask for help. That takes a brave heart." She finished cleaning his feet and handed him the towel. "Now let's go to the kitchen. Mrs. Anderson made some wonderful food this morning, and there's plenty for both of us." Francis followed Helen through the mansion, his mouth hanging open at everything he saw. They entered a kitchen that was bigger than any room Francis had ever lived in. The counters were made of shiny stone. The refrigerator was huge and silver. And on the table sat the most beautiful birthday cake Francis had ever seen. It was covered in white frosting with pink flowers made of sugar. 60 candles stood ready to be lit. "Sit down," Helen said, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. "Do you like chicken?" "I like anything, ma'am," Francis said honestly. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Helen's heart broke. 2 days. This child hadn't eaten in 2 days. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out containers of food. Roasted chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. Fresh bread. She heated everything up and made Francis a plate so full the food was almost falling off. Francis stared at the plate like it was made of gold. His hands shook as he picked up the fork. Then he stopped and looked at Helen. "Aren't you going to eat too, ma'am?" Helen smiled. She hadn't had an appetite all day, but something about Francis's question made her feel hungry. "Yes, I'll make myself a plate too." They sat together at the kitchen table, the rich millionaire woman and the poor street boy, and they ate. Francis tried to eat slowly to have good manners, but he was so hungry. Helen watched him and kept putting more food on his plate. "Tell me about yourself, Francis," Helen said gently. "Where are your parents?" Francis stopped chewing. His eyes became sad. "They died, ma'am. 3 years ago. There was a big fire in our apartment building. My mom and dad, they didn't make it out." "Oh, Francis," Helen whispered. "I'm so sorry." "After that, I lived with my uncle for a while," Francis continued, his voice quiet. "But he didn't want me. He said I was too expensive to feed. So he told me to leave. I've been living on the streets ever since. I sleep in doorways. Sometimes the church lets me sleep on their steps. I look for food in trash cans. Sometimes people give me money or food. Most times they don't." Helen felt tears running down her cheeks. This child, only 11 years old, had suffered so much. And yet, there was still light in his eyes. Still hope. "Do you go to school?" Helen asked. Francis shook his head. "No, ma'am. I used to love school. I was good at reading and math. But after my parents died, I had to stop. You can't go to school when you don't have a home or clean clothes or food." "What do you dream about, Francis?" Helen asked. "If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Francis thought for a moment, chewing slowly on a piece of chicken. "I dream about having a family again. Not a rich family. Just people who love me. I dream about going back to school. I dream about having a bed to sleep in and food to eat every day. I dream about becoming someone important one day so I can help other kids like me who have nobody." Helen wiped her tears. Here was a child who had every reason to be angry, bitter, and hateful. But instead, he dreamed of helping others. He dreamed of love and education and making the world better. "Those are beautiful dreams, Francis," Helen said. "And I believe dreams can come true." "Do you really think so, ma'am?" Francis asked, his eyes full of hope. "I know so," Helen said firmly. They finished eating and Helen brought out the birthday cake. "Francis, would you like to help me celebrate?" "Me? But it's your birthday, ma'am." "And you're my guest," Helen said, placing the cake between them. "Let's light these candles together." Helen lit all 60 candles, and they flickered in the kitchen like tiny stars. Francis stared at them in wonder. "Now we're supposed to sing Happy Birthday," Helen said. "But I'll feel silly singing to myself. Will you sing with me?" Francis nodded eagerly. And there, in that big kitchen, a poor street boy and a dying millionaire sang Happy Birthday together. Francis's voice was young and clear. Helen's voice was soft and tired. But together they made the most beautiful sound Helen had heard in years. "Make a wish, ma'am," Francis said excitedly. You have to make a wish before you blow out the candles. Helen closed her eyes. She had so many wishes. She wished she wasn't sick. She wished her children loved her. She wished she wasn't so lonely. But as she stood there with Francis beside her, she made a different wish. She wished that this boy, this pure-hearted, brave, kind boy, would have a chance at a better life. She opened her eyes and blew out the candles. Francis clapped and cheered like it was the greatest thing he'd ever seen. They ate cake together, laughing as frosting got on their faces. Francis told Helen stories about the funny things he'd seen on the streets. Helen told Francis stories about when she was young and poor, just like him, and how she worked hard to build her business. You were poor once, ma'am? Francis asked, surprised. Very poor, Helen said. My sister Vivian and I shared one dress between us. We ate rice and beans every single day. But I never gave up. I dreamed of a better life and I worked hard to get it. That's amazing, Francis said with admiration. You're like a superhero. Helen laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. I'm no superhero, Francis. I'm just a person who kept going even when things were hard. That's what makes you a superhero, Francis said seriously. They talked for hours. About life. About dreams. About God and faith. Francis told Helen how he prayed every night, even though he slept on cold streets. I believe God has a plan for me, he said. I don't know what it is yet, but I believe it. Helen was amazed. This child had more faith than anyone she knew. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple, Francis stood up. I should go, ma'am. Thank you so much for the food and for being so kind to me. This was the best day I've had in 3 years. Where will you sleep tonight? Helen asked, worried. Oh, there's a spot behind the library where they have a vent that blows warm air, Francis said casually. It's not too bad. Helen's heart hurt. She couldn't let this child sleep on the streets. Not tonight. Not after the gift he had given her, the gift of company, of kindness, of reminding her that good people still existed in the world. Francis, Helen said carefully, how would you like to stay here tonight? Francis's eyes went wide with shock. Stay here? In your house, ma'am? Are you sure? I'm very sure, Helen said with a warm smile. I have 15 bedrooms in this mansion and all of them are empty. You can pick whichever one you like. And tomorrow morning we'll have breakfast together. Francis couldn't believe what he was hearing. A real bed? A safe place to sleep? It seemed too good to be true. But ma'am, what if your family comes? Won't they be angry? Helen's smile faded a little. She looked out the window at the darkening sky. My family didn't come today, Francis. And I don't think they will. But it's your birthday, Francis said, confused. How could they not come? Helen sighed deeply. Sometimes, Francis, people forget what's important. They get so busy with their own lives that they forget about the people who love them. Francis thought about this. Even though he had nothing, he would never forget someone who loved him. If he had a mother or father, he would visit them every single day. That's sad, ma'am, Francis said quietly. If you were my family, I would never forget you. Not even for one day. Helen felt tears coming to her eyes again. This child, this beautiful, pure-hearted child, understood love better than her own children did. Thank you, Francis, she said softly. That means more to me than you know. Now come on, let me show you where you can sleep. Helen led Francis up the grand staircase. His bare feet sank into the thick carpet. She showed him a bedroom on the second floor that was bigger than any place Francis had ever lived. It had a huge bed with soft pillows and a thick blanket. There was a window with curtains that looked out over the garden. A closet full of clean towels. And best of all, a bathroom with a real shower. This room is yours for tonight, Helen said. There are clean towels in the bathroom. Take a nice hot shower. I'll find some clean clothes for you to wear. They might be a bit big, but they'll be better than what you have on now. Francis walked around the room slowly, touching things gently like he was afraid they might break. Ma'am, I've never slept in a bed this nice. I've never even seen a room this beautiful. Well, tonight you will, Helen said. And Francis? Don't be afraid to use anything you need. The soap, the shampoo, the towels, they're all for you. After Helen left, Francis stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, wondering if this was all a dream. Would he wake up on the cold street, hungry and alone? He pinched himself. It hurt. This was real. He went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Hot water poured out, filling the room with steam. Francis stepped under it and felt 3 years of dirt and sadness washing away. He scrubbed his skin until it was clean. He washed his hair with shampoo that smelled like coconuts. He stayed in that shower for 20 minutes, enjoying the warmth. When he came out, he found clean clothes folded on the bed. A soft t-shirt and sweatpants. They were too big for him, but they were clean and warm. Francis put them on and looked at himself in the mirror. He barely recognized the boy staring back at him. Clean, fresh, almost normal looking. He climbed into the big bed and pulled the soft blanket over himself. The mattress was so comfortable that Francis thought he might be lying on a cloud. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Thank you, God, for Mrs. Helen. Please bless her and keep her safe. And please help her family to remember how special she is. Amen. Within minutes, Francis was fast asleep, sleeping more peacefully than he had in 3 years. Downstairs, Helen sat in her living room, feeling more alive than she had felt in months. Today had started as the loneliest day of her life. But Francis had changed everything. He reminded her why she worked so hard all those years. Not for money. Not for a big house. But to make a difference. To help people. To show kindness. She picked up her phone and looked at it one more time. Still no messages from Janet, Jacob, or Vivian. It was almost 8 o'clock at night now. Her birthday was almost over, and her family had completely forgotten her. Helen felt the familiar sadness creeping back into her heart. But then she thought about Francis sleeping upstairs, safe and warm for the first time in years, and she smiled. Maybe blood relatives weren't the only kind of family that mattered. She was about to turn off her phone when suddenly she heard a car pulling into the driveway. Then another car. Then voices outside. Helen stood up, her heart beating fast. Were they here? Had her children finally remembered? The front door burst open and in walked Janet, wearing an expensive designer dress and high heels. Behind her came Jacob in a fancy suit, and behind him was Vivian, carrying a small gift bag. Surprise! They all shouted together, though their voices didn't sound very excited. Helen stood there, frozen. It was 8 o'clock at night. Her birthday was almost over. And now they showed up? Happy birthday, Mom. Janet said, walking over and giving Helen a quick hug that felt cold and fake. Sorry we're late. I had a hair appointment that ran long. Yeah, happy birthday, Jacob said, barely looking at his mother. He was typing on his phone. I had some business meetings that I couldn't get out of. Vivian handed Helen the small gift bag. Happy birthday, sister. I would have come earlier, but you know how busy life gets. Helen took the gift bag slowly. She wanted to feel happy that they came, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. We brought champagne. Janet said, holding up an expensive bottle. Let's celebrate. Jacob walked into the living room and plopped down on the couch like he owned the place. This house is so big, Mom. When are you going to downsize? You don't need all this space. I brought some snacks, Vivian said, putting a small box of cookies on the table. I know it's not much, but I'm a little short on money this month. Maybe you could help me out. There it was. They hadn't even been in the house for 2 minutes, and Vivian was already asking for money. Helen felt her heart sinking. They didn't come because they loved her. They didn't come because they missed her. They came out of obligation. And maybe because they wanted something. Let's have some cake, Janet said, walking toward the kitchen. You did make a cake, right, Mom? Helen followed them into the kitchen, feeling tired and sick. The birthday cake sat on the counter, but most of it was already gone. She and Francis had eaten it together hours ago. Mom, why is there only half a cake left? Janet asked, annoyed. Did you eat your birthday cake by yourself? That's kind of sad. I didn't eat it by myself, Helen said quietly. I shared it with a guest. A guest? Jacob said, looking up from his phone for the first time. Who came to visit you? Before Helen could answer, they heard a noise from upstairs. A door opening. Footsteps on the stairs. Francis appeared at the top of the staircase, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He had heard voices and woke up. When he saw the strangers in the house, he froze. Janet, Jacob, and Vivian all stared at Francis with their mouths open. Who is that? Janet said, her voice sharp and mean. Francis stood on the stairs, looking scared. He was still wearing the clean clothes Helen had given him, and his hair was still damp from the shower. Who is that? Janet said, her voice sharp and mean. That's my guest, Helen said firmly. His name is Francis. Your guest. Jacob said, standing up. Mom, that's a street kid. Look at him. What is he doing in our house? This is my house, Helen said, her voice stronger now. And Francis is my guest. I invited him to stay. Vivian walked closer to the stairs, staring at Francis like he was a bug. Helen, have you lost your mind? You can't just bring homeless children into your home. He probably has diseases. He probably wants to rob you. He's not going to rob anyone, Helen said angrily. He's a good boy who needed help, and I helped him. A good boy. Jacob said with a nasty laugh. He started walking toward the stairs. He's a beggar. A thief. Mom, where's your jewelry? Did you check? I bet he's already stolen half of it. I didn't steal anything, Francis said, his voice shaking. I would never. Shut up. Janet screamed at him. Nobody asked you to speak, you little rat. Francis flinched like he'd been hit. Helen saw tears forming in the boy's eyes. Don't you dare speak to him like that, Helen said, stepping between her daughter and Francis. But Jacob was already climbing the stairs toward Francis. Get out of this house. Now, before I throw you out myself. Jacob, stop it. Helen shouted, but she felt weak. Her sickness made it hard to move fast. Jacob grabbed Francis by the arm roughly. Francis cried out in pain. Let him go. Helen screamed. This dirty street trash doesn't belong here. Jacob yelled, dragging Francis down the stairs. Francis tried to pull away, but Jacob was too strong. Please, sir, you're hurting me. Francis cried. Good. Jacob said cruelly. Maybe that'll teach you not to sneak into people's houses. Janet joined in, pushing Francis toward the door. You came here to trick our mother. To steal from her. Well, we're not stupid. Get out. Get out. Get out. Vivian opened the front door. Go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of. They shoved Francis out the door so hard that he fell on the driveway, scraping his hands on the concrete. The clean clothes Helen had given him got dirty again. Francis looked up at them with tears streaming down his face. I didn't do anything wrong, Francis said, sobbing. I just wanted to celebrate her birthday with her. Well, she doesn't need you, Jacob shouted. She has a real family. Now get lost before I call the police and tell them you're a trespasser. Francis stood up slowly, his hands bleeding from the fall. He looked past Jacob and Janet and Vivian, trying to see Mrs. Helen. She was standing in the doorway, crying, looking weak and helpless. Thank you for the food, Mrs. Helen, Francis called out, his voice breaking. And happy birthday. I'll never forget your kindness. Then he turned and ran down the driveway, through the gate, and disappeared into the dark street. Jacob slammed the door shut. Finally, that little pest is gone. Helen stood there, shaking. Not from her sickness this time, but from rage and heartbreak. She looked at her children and her sister, and for the first time in her life, she saw them clearly. She saw them for who they really were. They weren't busy. They weren't stressed. They were selfish. They were cruel. They were monsters. How could you? Helen whispered. How could you treat a child like that? Oh, please, Mom, Janet said, walking to the kitchen and pouring herself some champagne. We did you a favor. That kid was obviously playing you. He probably does this to rich old people all the time. He wasn't playing me, Helen said, her voice getting louder. He's an orphan. He's been living on the streets for 3 years. He came here asking for food and I gave it to him. That's called kindness. That's called being a decent human being. Something you three know nothing about. Don't yell at us, Jacob said coldly. We came here for your birthday and this is the thanks we get? You came here at 8 o'clock at night. Helen shouted. 8 o'clock. My birthday started this morning. I waited all day for you. I sat here alone, sick, dying, hoping one of you would remember me. And nobody came. Nobody called. Nobody cared. We're here now, aren't we? Vivian said, annoyed. You're here now because you felt guilty, Helen said, tears running down her face. Or because you want something from me. That's the only time any of you ever show up. When you need money. When you want something. That's not fair, Janet said, but she didn't sound convincing. Isn't it? Helen said. When was the last time any of you visited me just to visit? When was the last time you called me just to ask how I'm feeling? When was the last time you did anything for me without expecting something in return? The room went quiet. None of them had an answer. Helen looked at each of them one by one. Janet, who spent her days shopping and partying with Helen's money. Jacob, who stole from Helen's business account and didn't even hide it. Vivian, who always had her hand out, always asking for loans she never paid back. And then she thought about Francis, a boy who had nothing. A boy who was hungry and homeless. But when she invited him in, he worried about making her floor dirty. When she gave him food, he asked if she was going to eat too. When she offered him a place to sleep, he thanked God in his prayers. He didn't ask her for money. He didn't demand anything. He just showed her kindness and respect. That boy has more goodness in his heart than all three of you combined, Helen said quietly. Oh, for heaven's sake, Jacob said, throwing his hands up. Are you seriously comparing us to some street kid? Yes, Helen said firmly. And he wins. He treated me better in one afternoon than you've treated me in years. You're being ridiculous, Janet said, drinking her champagne. You're sick, you're emotional, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have, Helen said. And I see exactly who you are. All of you. You don't love me. You love my money. That's not true, Vivian said, but even she didn't sound sure. Prove it then, Helen said. Stay here with me tonight. Talk to me. Spend time with me. Not because it's my birthday. Not because you want something. Just because you care. Jacob checked his watch. I can't. I have plans later tonight. I have an early yoga class tomorrow, Janet said. I'm really tired, Vivian added. Maybe another time. There it was. The truth. Helen asked for one thing, just their time, and they all had excuses. Helen walked slowly to the couch and sat down. She suddenly felt very, very tired. The sickness was pulling at her, making her body hurt. But the emotional pain hurt even more. Get out, Helen said quietly. What? Jacob said. Get out of my house, Helen repeated louder this time. All of you. Leave. Mom, come on, Janet said. Don't be like this. I said get out. Helen screamed with whatever strength she had left. Get out and don't come back unless you're ready to act like real family. Jacob grabbed his car keys. Fine. We'll go. But don't come crying to us later. Yeah, Janet said, grabbing her purse. Maybe you should have thought about this before you chose that street kid over us. They walked toward the door. Vivian paused and looked back at Helen. Helen, I still need that loan I asked about. Can we talk about it later this week? Even now, even after everything, Vivian was asking for money. Helen just shook her head sadly. Goodbye, Vivian. They left, slamming the door behind them. Helen heard their cars start and drive away. And then the house was silent again. Empty again. Lonely again. But this time Helen wasn't just sad. She was angry. And disappointed. And heartbroken. Because tonight she finally understood the truth. Her children didn't love her. They loved what she could give them. And that was the most painful realization of all. Helen sat in her living room crying. Not just for herself but for Francis too. That poor boy had been treated so cruelly. He had been pushed and insulted and thrown out like garbage. And for what? For being poor? For accepting kindness when it was offered? Helen wiped her tears and made a decision. Tomorrow she would find Francis. She would apologize. She would make this right. But tonight she sat alone in her mansion, surrounded by expensive things that meant nothing, missing the one person who had actually made her birthday special. Meanwhile, Francis ran through the dark streets, tears blurring his vision. His hands stung from where he had scraped them on the driveway. The clean clothes Mrs. Helen had given him were dirty again. But what hurt most wasn't his hands or his pride. It was his heart. For a few beautiful hours, he had felt like he mattered. Like he was worth something. Mrs. Helen had treated him like a real person, like someone important. She had washed his feet. She had fed him at her table. She had given him a bed to sleep in. She had made him feel loved. But her family had reminded him of the truth. He was just a street kid. Just a beggar. Just someone people looked down on. Francis found his usual sleeping spot behind the library. The warm air vent was blowing like always, but tonight it didn't feel warm enough. Nothing felt warm anymore. He curled up against the wall, hugging his knees to his chest. He thought about Mrs. Helen's kind face. Her gentle smile. The way she had listened to his stories like they mattered. The way she had told him that dreams could come true. But dreams don't come true for kids like me, Francis whispered to himself in the darkness. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but he kept seeing the angry faces of Mrs. Helen's children. The way they had grabbed him. The way they had called him names. The way they had pushed him out the door like he was trash. Francis cried himself to sleep that night, wondering if he would ever feel safe and loved again. The next morning, the sun woke Francis up early. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground. His stomach growled with hunger. The wonderful meal from yesterday felt like a distant dream. He stood up slowly and started walking down the street looking for food. Maybe someone would throw away some bread. Maybe someone would drop some change. Maybe. Francis stopped walking. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Helen. Was she okay? Her family had been so mean to her too. They had yelled at her. They had made her cry. And she was sick. Very sick. What if she needed help? What if she was alone again, sad and lonely like she had been yesterday morning? Francis stood on the corner, thinking hard. Part of him was scared to go back to that mansion. What if her children were still there? What if they called the police like they had threatened? What if they hurt him worse this time? But another part of him, the bigger part, knew what he had to do. Mrs. Helen had been kind to him when nobody else was. She had treated him with dignity and love. And now she needed someone. She needed a friend. Francis made up his mind. He would go back. Not for food this time. Not for a place to sleep. But because Mrs. Helen needed him, and real friends show up when someone needs them. He walked for 30 minutes back to Maple Street. His bare feet hurt on the hot sidewalk, but he kept going. When he reached the mansion, he stood outside the gate for a long time, gathering his courage. The house looked quiet. No cars in the driveway. Maybe her children had left. Maybe it was safe to check on her. Francis quietly opened the gate and walked up to the house. Instead of going to the front door where someone might see him, he went around to the back. There was a beautiful garden there with flowers and trees and a small patio. And there, lying on a chair on the patio, was Mrs. Helen. Francis's heart jumped with worry. She was lying very still, her face red and painful looking. She had fallen asleep in the sun, and now her skin was burned. Her breathing sounded difficult. Mrs. Helen? Francis called softly, walking closer. Helen's eyes opened slowly. She looked confused at first, like she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. Then she saw Francis and tears filled her eyes. "Francis," she whispered. "You came back." "I had to," Francis said, kneeling beside her chair. "I was worried about you. Mrs. Helen, your skin is really burned. You've been in the sun too long." Helen tried to sit up but winced in pain. "I came out here after they left last night. I couldn't sleep. I must have fallen asleep out here by accident. Oh, Francis, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for how they treated you." "It's okay," Francis said, though his voice shook a little. "It's not your fault." "It's my fault," Helen said, starting to cry. "I raised them. I gave them everything. And they turned out to be cruel and selfish. But you have nothing, and you have the biggest heart I've ever seen. You came back even after they hurt you. Because you were kind to me," Francis said simply. "And I think you need help right now. Let me help you inside. We need to get something on your sunburn." Francis helped Helen stand up slowly. She was weak and dizzy. He put her arm around his shoulder and walked her carefully back into the house. Even though he was just a small 11-year-old boy, he was strong from living on the streets. He knew how to survive. He knew how to take care of himself. And now he would take care of Mrs. Helen. Inside, Francis sat Helen down on the couch. "Do you have any aloe vera?" he asked. "Or lotion for burns?" Helen pointed weakly toward the bathroom upstairs. "In the medicine cabinet. There should be some cream there." Francis ran upstairs and found the cream. He also grabbed a clean towel and wet it with cool water. When he came back down, he gently applied the cool towel to Helen's sunburned face and arms. "That feels better," Helen sighed. "Thank you, Francis." Francis then carefully put the cream on her burns. His hands were gentle and careful. "My mom used to do this when I got sunburned," he said quietly. Before the fire. Helen watched this young boy taking care of her, and her heart filled with love. Here was a child who had lost everything. His parents, his home, his childhood, and yet he still knew how to love. He still knew how to give. "Francis," Helen said, "I need to tell you something. I'm very sick. The doctors say I only have a few months left to live." Francis's hand stopped moving. He looked at her with wide, scared eyes. You're dying?" Helen nodded sadly. "Yes. I have an illness that can't be cured. That's why yesterday meant so much to me. You gave me the best birthday I've had in years. Maybe the best birthday I've ever had." Francis felt tears running down his face. "But that's not fair. You're such a good person. Why do bad things happen to good people?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Helen said softly. "But I've learned something important. It's not about how long you live. It's about how you live. And yesterday you reminded me how to live with joy and kindness." Francis wiped his tears. "Can I stay with you? I mean, not forever. I know I can't. But maybe I can help you? I can get you water when you need it. I can make sure you eat. I can keep you company so you're not lonely. Please?" Helen's heart broke and healed at the same time. "Francis, you would do that for me? Even after what my family did to you?" "Your family was mean," Francis said honestly. "But you weren't mean. You were the nicest person I've ever met. And I don't want you to be alone anymore." Helen pulled Francis into a gentle hug, careful of her sunburned skin. "Then yes, Francis, please stay. Stay as long as you want. You can have that bedroom upstairs. You can eat meals with me. You can be my family." "Really?" Francis said, his voice full of hope. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Helen said. From now on you're not just my guest. You're my friend. My companion. My boy. Francis hugged her tighter. For the first time since his parents died, he felt like he had a home again. Over the next few weeks, Francis became Helen's caretaker. Every morning he woke up early and made her tea the way she liked it. He helped her take her medicine. He read to her from books in her library. He told her funny stories to make her laugh. He pushed her wheelchair through the garden when she was too weak to walk. And Helen taught Francis things too. She helped him practice his reading and math. She told him stories about business and life. She taught him about kindness and dignity and standing up for what's right. They became best friends. The dying millionaire and the street boy. Two people who had nothing in common except loneliness, who found everything they needed in each other. Helen's children never came back to visit. They called sometimes, but only to ask about money or to complain about something. Helen's sister Vivian called twice, both times asking for loans. Helen said no every time now. One evening, as Francis was helping Helen eat her dinner, she looked at him seriously. "Francis, I need to tell you something important," she said. "I need you to listen very carefully." Francis put down the spoon and gave her his full attention. "I'm listening, Mrs. Helen." "I've made a very important decision," Helen said. "And I've done something that my children are not going to like. But it's the right thing to do. I know it in my heart." Francis looked at her with worried eyes. "What decision, Mrs. Helen? Are you okay?" Helen took a deep breath. "A few days ago I called my lawyer. His name is Edward Miller. He's been my lawyer for 20 years and he's a good, honest man. I asked him to come to the house." "A lawyer?" Francis said nervously. "Am I in trouble? Do I have to leave?" No, sweetheart," Helen said quickly, reaching out to hold his hand. "You're not in trouble. Just the opposite. Francis, I asked Edward to help me change my will." Francis didn't understand what that meant. "What's a will?" "A will is a legal document," Helen explained gently. "It tells people what should happen to your money and property after you die. Who gets your house, your business, your bank accounts, everything." Francis nodded slowly, starting to understand. "So you wrote down who gets your stuff when you're gone?" "Exactly," Helen said. "And Francis, I want you to know what I decided. Before I met you, my will said that everything would be split between my two children, Janet and Jacob. They would each get half of everything I own." "That makes sense," Francis said. "They're your children." "But they're not good children," Helen said, her voice firm. "They don't love me. They love my money. And I've realized something important. Family isn't just about blood. Family is about love. About loyalty. About showing up when someone needs you." Helen squeezed Francis's hand tighter. "You showed up, Francis. You came back even after they hurt you. You took care of me when I was sick. You made me laugh when I was sad. You gave me more love in these few weeks than my own children gave me in years." Francis felt his heart beating faster. He wasn't sure where this was going, but it felt important. "So I changed my will," Helen continued. "I took Janet and Jacob out of it completely. And I put someone else in." "Who?" Francis asked. Helen smiled, tears running down her face. "You, Francis. I made you my sole heir. That means when I die, everything I own will go to you. The house, the business, the money in the bank, everything. It all belongs to you." Francis's mouth dropped open. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Me? But I'm nobody. I'm just a street kid." "You are not nobody," Helen said strongly. "You are Francis, the bravest, kindest, most wonderful boy I've ever known. And you deserve a chance at a good life. You deserve to have your dreams come true." "But what about your children?" Francis asked, worried. "Won't they be really, really angry?" "Yes," Helen said honestly. "They will be furious. They'll probably try to fight it in court. They'll probably say terrible things about you and about me. But Edward assured me that the will is legal and strong. As long as I'm of sound mind when I sign it, which I am, it will hold up in court." Francis felt overwhelmed. "Mrs. Helen, I don't know what to say. I never wanted your money. I just wanted to help you." "I know, sweetheart," Helen said. "That's exactly why you deserve it. If you had wanted my money, I never would have given it to you. But you wanted something more valuable, friendship and love. And that tells me you'll use this gift the right way." "What do you mean?" Francis asked. Helen smiled. "I mean that I trust you to continue my legacy. I made my money by working hard and being honest. But I also made it so I could help people. I've donated to charities, helped people start businesses, supported children who needed education. And I want you to do the same." She pulled out an envelope from beside her chair. This is a letter I wrote for you. Inside, I've written down everything I want you to know. How to handle money wisely. How to finish your education. How to help other children who are living on the streets like you were. Francis, I want you to take this money and make the world better. Francis took the envelope with shaking hands. I promise I will, Mrs. Helen. I promise I'll make you proud. You already make me proud, Helen said. Every single day. They sat together quietly for a moment, holding hands. Then Helen spoke again, her voice more serious. Francis, there's something else I need to tell you. Something very important. My lawyer Edward lives at 42 Oak Street. His office is the blue building on the corner. I need you to remember that address. Can you do that? 42 Oak Street, Francis repeated. Blue building on the corner. Why do I need to remember that? Helen's eyes filled with tears. Because when I die, my children will find out about the will. And they will be very angry. They might try to scare you or hurt you or make you go away. If that happens, I need you to go straight to Edward's office. He will protect you. He will make sure you're safe. Promise me you'll remember. I promise, Francis said, feeling scared now. But Mrs. Helen, don't talk about dying. Maybe you'll get better. Maybe the doctors were wrong. Helen smiled sadly. I wish that were true, sweetheart. But I can feel my body getting weaker every day. I don't think I have much time left. Then I'll take even better care of you, Francis said, his voice determined. I'll make sure every day you have left is a good day. And that's exactly what Francis did. Every morning he brought Helen breakfast in bed. Every afternoon he pushed her wheelchair through the garden and they looked at the flowers together. Every evening he read to her until she fell asleep. Helen grew weaker, but she also grew happier. Francis's presence was like medicine for her lonely heart. She laughed more in those weeks than she had in years. One day Helen asked Francis to bring her something from her bedroom. There's a wooden box on my dresser, she said. Can you bring it to me? Francis brought her the beautiful wooden box. Inside were old photographs. Helen picked up one photo and smiled. This is me when I was your age, she said, showing Francis a picture of a young girl with a bright smile. I was poor just like you. I wore the same dress every day. I never had enough to eat. But I had dreams, Francis. Big dreams. And I never gave up on them. Francis looked at the photo in amazement. You really were like me. I was you, Helen said. That's why I understand you so well. And that's why I believe in you so much. If I could go from that poor little girl to where I am now, imagine what you can do. You're smarter than I was. You're kinder than I was. You're going to do amazing things, Francis. Francis felt tears in his eyes. I hope so. I want to make you proud. You will, Helen said confidently. She pulled out another photograph from the box. This one is for you to keep. It's my favorite picture of myself. I want you to have it so you can remember me when I'm gone. The photograph showed Helen as a young woman, maybe 30 years old, standing in front of her first furniture store. She looked strong and proud and happy. I'll keep it forever, Francis promised, holding the photo carefully. And I'll look at it whenever I need to remember to be brave. That's my boy, Helen said, patting his hand. Days passed. Helen grew weaker and weaker. She could barely eat now. She slept most of the day. But whenever she was awake, Francis was there, holding her hand, talking to her, making sure she wasn't alone. One night, Helen's breathing became very difficult. Francis stayed by her bedside, scared but trying to be brave for her. Francis, Helen whispered, her voice very weak. Come closer. Francis leaned in close so he could hear her. I need you to be strong, Helen said, struggling with each word. When I'm gone, remember everything I taught you. Remember that you're special. Remember that you're loved. Remember that dreams come true for those who never give up. I'll remember, Francis said, tears streaming down his face. I promise I'll remember everything. And Francis, Helen continued, her eyes looking into his. When they read my will, when everyone finds out, don't be afraid. Edward will protect you. The law will protect you. And I'll be watching over you from heaven. Please don't go, Francis sobbed. Please don't leave me alone again. You won't be alone, Helen whispered. You'll have Edward. You'll have your future. You'll have all those children you're going to help someday. And you'll have my love, forever. Helen reached up with her weak hand and touched Francis's face gently. Thank you for giving me the best final chapter of my life. Thank you for reminding me what love really is. Thank you for saving me, Francis said, holding her hand against his cheek. Thank you for being my family. Helen smiled one last time. You were the best birthday present I ever received. Her eyes closed slowly. Her breathing became softer and softer. And then, peacefully, like someone falling asleep after a long, tiring day, Christian Helen took her last breath. Francis sat there holding her hand, crying. He cried for the woman who had saved him. He cried for the friend he had lost. He cried for the only person who had truly loved him in 3 long years. But even through his tears, Francis knew something important. Mrs. Helen had given him more than money or a house. She had given him hope. She had given him a future. She had given him the courage to dream again. And he would honor her memory by becoming the person she believed he could be. Francis stayed with Helen until morning came. Then, with shaking hands, he called the number she had written down for emergencies. He called Edward Miller, the lawyer. Mr. Miller? Francis said when a man answered. This is Francis. Mrs. Helen. She's gone. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Edward's kind voice said, I'll be right there, son. Don't move. Don't let anyone in. I'm coming to help you. Francis hung up and sat back down beside Helen. He held her hand one more time and whispered, I won't let you down, Mrs. Helen. I promise. Within an hour, Edward Miller arrived at the mansion. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes behind his glasses. He wore a dark suit and carried a briefcase. Francis opened the door, his eyes red from crying. You must be Francis, Edward said gently. Mrs. Helen told me a lot about you. She did? Francis asked, wiping his tears. Oh yes, Edward said with a small smile. She called you her miracle. She said you gave her joy in her final days. That's a beautiful gift you gave her, young man. Edward went upstairs to see Helen. He made some phone calls, to the doctor, to the funeral home, to people who needed to know. Francis listened as Edward handled everything with calm professionalism. When Edward came back downstairs, he sat down with Francis in the living room. Francis, I know this is a very difficult time, Edward said. But there are some things we need to talk about. Mrs. Helen made me promise to take care of you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Okay, Francis said quietly. First, you need to know that Mrs. Helen's children, Janet and Jacob, will need to be informed that their mother has passed away. They will come here probably very soon. And they're going to be difficult. Because of the will? Francis asked. Edward looked surprised. She told you about the will? Francis nodded. She said she made me her heir. She said they would be angry. That's putting it mildly, Edward said with a sigh. Francis, when they find out that you've inherited everything, they're going to be furious. They might say terrible things to you. They might try to scare you. But I need you to understand something very important. The will is completely legal. Mrs. Helen was of sound mind when she signed it. She knew exactly what she was doing. And no matter what they say or do, that will cannot be easily broken. What should I do when they come? Francis asked, feeling scared. Stay calm, Edward said. Don't argue with them. Don't let them bully you. And most importantly, don't sign anything they give you. Nothing. Even if they say it's just a simple form or document. You sign nothing without me looking at it first. Do you understand? I understand, Francis said. Good, Edward said. Now I'm going to make the phone calls to Janet and Jacob. In the meantime, I want you to pack up anything that's important to you. The photograph Mrs. Helen gave you, the letter she wrote, any clothes she bought for you. Put them all in a bag and keep that bag with you at all times. Why? Francis asked. Because when they arrive, they might try to throw you out, Edward explained honestly. And I want to make sure you have your important things with you when that happens. But don't worry, you won't be on the streets again. If they force you to leave this house, you'll come home with me. My wife and I have a spare bedroom, and you're welcome to stay there until we sort everything out. Francis felt a wave of relief. Thank you, Mr. Miller. You're very kind, just like Mrs. Helen said. Mrs. Helen was special, Edward said, his voice sad. I've been her lawyer for 20 years, and I watched her children break her heart over and over again. I'm glad she found you, Francis. You made her last days happy. That means everything. Edward made the phone calls. Francis could hear him speaking in a serious, professional voice. Janet, this is Edward Miller, your mother's lawyer. I'm calling with difficult news. Your mother passed away this morning? Yes, I'm very sorry. The funeral arrangements will be made this week. Yes, there will be a reading of the will. I'll send you the details. The same conversation happened with Jacob and then with Vivian. After Edward hung up, he looked at Francis. They're on their way. Janet said she'd be here in an hour. Jacob and Vivian are coming too. It's going to get ugly, Francis. Are you ready? I think so, Francis said, though his hands were shaking. Remember, Edward said, putting a reassuring hand on Francis's shoulder. You have every right to be here. Mrs. Helen wanted you here. And I will not let them hurt you. They didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, Francis heard cars pulling up outside. Doors slamming. Voices shouting. His heart started beating fast. The front door burst open. Janet stormed in, wearing all black like she was already dressed for the funeral. Behind her came Jacob, looking angry. And behind him came Vivian, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though Francis noticed she wasn't actually crying. Where is she? Janet demanded. Where's our mother? Upstairs, Edward said calmly. The funeral home will be here soon too. Janet pushed past him and ran upstairs. Jacob followed her. Francis could hear them crying and wailing upstairs, though it sounded fake to his ears. They hadn't visited their mother in weeks, but now they were acting like they were heartbroken. Vivian saw Francis sitting on the couch and her eyes narrowed. You. What are you doing here? Didn't we throw you out? Mrs. Helen invited me back, Francis said quietly, trying to remember what Edward had told him. Stay calm. Don't argue. Invited you back? Vivian said with a nasty laugh. Oh, I see what happened. You came back and tricked my poor sick sister. You took advantage of her. I did not. Francis said, his voice rising. I took care of her. I was here when she needed someone and you weren't. How dare you? Vivian shouted, taking a step toward Francis. Edward immediately stood between them. Mrs. Vivian, I suggest you step back. Francis is here at Mrs. Helen's request, and he has every right to be here. We'll see about that, Vivian said coldly. Janet and Jacob came back downstairs. Janet's makeup was running from her fake tears. Jacob's face was red with anger. I can't believe she's gone, Janet sobbed dramatically. My poor mother. She died alone. She didn't die alone, Francis said before he could stop himself. I was with her. I held her hand. She wasn't alone. All three of them turned to stare at Francis like he was an insect they wanted to crush. You were with her? Jacob said, his voice dangerous. You? Some street rat she picked up off the sidewalk? Jacob, please, Edward said firmly. This is not the time or place. No, I want to know. Jacob shouted, pointing at Francis. What was he doing here? Why was he with our mother when she died and we weren't? Because I was here every day, Francis said, his voice shaking but honest. I took care of her. I fed her. I read to her. I made sure she took her medicine. Where were you? The room went silent. Janet, Jacob, and Vivian all stared at Francis with hatred in their eyes. You little, Jacob started, moving toward Francis. Enough. Edward said loudly, stepping between them again. Everyone needs to calm down. This is not helping anyone. Fine, Janet said, trying to control her anger. We're calm. Now, Edward, we need to discuss the funeral arrangements. And the estate. We need to start going through Mother's papers, her bank accounts, her properties. All of that will be handled at the appropriate time, Edward said professionally. The funeral will be held in 3 days at St. Mary's Church. After the funeral, we will have the reading of the will. The will, Jacob said, a greedy look in his eyes. Yes. I assume everything is split 50-50 between Janet and me, like Mother always said it would be? Edward's face remained neutral. The contents of the will shall be revealed at the reading as is proper. Not before. Oh, come on, Edward, Vivian said. We're family. Surely you can tell us now? No, Edward said firmly. I cannot and will not. The reading will happen after the funeral as Mrs. Helen requested. Everyone named in the will shall be present. Everyone named in the will? Janet said suspiciously. Who else is named in the will besides Jacob and me? Edward said nothing, but his eyes briefly flickered toward Francis. Jacob caught the look. His face turned red with rage. No. Tell me that street kid is not in my mother's will. The contents of the will, Edward began. Answer me, Jacob screamed. Edward stood tall, his voice firm and commanding. Mr. Jacob, I will not be bullied or intimidated in this manner. The reading of the will shall take place after the funeral, and not one moment before. That is final. If you cannot control yourself, I will ask you to leave this house immediately. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. His whole body was shaking with rage. This is my mother's house. I don't have to leave. Actually, Edward said calmly, this house belongs to Mrs. Helen's estate until the will is properly executed. And as the executor of that estate, I have the authority to remove anyone who is causing a disturbance. So I suggest you calm down or you will be escorted out. Janet grabbed her brother's arm. Jacob, stop it. We'll wait for the reading. It's only 3 days. She said this, but her eyes were cold and calculating as they looked at Francis. I'm sure Mother did the right thing and left everything to her real children. Francis felt sick to his stomach. He wanted to run away, to hide, to disappear. But he remembered Mrs. Helen's words. Be brave. Be strong. Don't let them scare you. I think it's best if we all leave now, Edward said. The funeral home will be here soon to take care of Mrs. Helen. We'll meet again at the church in 3 days for the funeral service. Francis, gather your things. You're coming with me. What? Vivian said sharply. He's going with you? Why would you take him? Because Mrs. Helen asked me to look after him, Edward said simply. And that's what I intend to do. This is ridiculous. Jacob shouted. That boy has been here for weeks, probably stealing from Mother, filling her head with lies. That is enough, Edward said, his voice like ice. I will not allow you to slander this child. Francis provided care and companionship to your mother during her final days, which is more than any of you did. Now, I suggest you leave before you say something you'll regret. Janet's eyes narrowed. She looked at Francis with pure hatred. We'll see what the will says. And if you've done anything to manipulate my mother, if you've tricked her in any way, we will destroy you. Francis wanted to say something back, but Edward put a hand on his shoulder. Don't respond, Edward whispered. Let them leave. One by one, Janet, Jacob, and Vivian left the mansion, each one giving Francis a look of pure poison as they walked out. When the door finally closed behind them, Francis let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. You did well, Edward said. You stayed calm. You spoke the truth. Mrs. Helen would be proud of you. I'm scared, Mr. Miller, Francis admitted. They hate me so much. They don't hate you, Edward said. They hate what you represent. You represent their own failures as children. You represent the fact that a stranger showed more love to their mother than they did. That's a hard truth for them to face, so they're taking it out on you. Francis went upstairs to the bedroom he had been staying in. He packed his few belongings, the clean clothes Mrs. Helen had bought him, the photograph she had given him, the letter she had written. Everything fit in one small bag. He took one last look at the room. Just a few weeks ago this had felt like a dream. A poor street boy sleeping in a mansion. Being cared for and loved. Having a family again. Now Mrs. Helen was gone and Francis felt more alone than ever. He went back downstairs where Edward was waiting. Ready? Edward asked kindly. Francis nodded. They waited until the funeral home came and carefully, respectfully took Mrs. Helen's body away. Francis cried again watching them carry her out. She looked so peaceful, so small. Then Francis and Edward left the mansion together. Edward's car was nice but not fancy. Inside it smelled like coffee and old books. My wife Sarah is looking forward to meeting you, Edward said as he drove. She's made up the guest room for you. We don't have any children of our own, so the house is pretty quiet. But you're welcome to stay as long as you need. Thank you, sir, Francis said quietly, looking out the window. They drove through the city to a neighborhood with smaller houses and big trees. Edward's house was modest and comfortable. Nothing like Mrs. Helen's mansion, but it felt warm and safe. Sarah Miller was a kind woman with graying hair and a gentle smile. She hugged Francis the moment she met him. Oh, you poor dear, she said. Edward told me everything. I'm so sorry about Mrs. Helen. But you're safe here with us. She showed Francis to a small bedroom with a comfortable bed, a desk, and a window that looked out at a garden. Make yourself at home, she said. If you need anything at all, just ask. That night at dinner, Francis sat with Edward and Sarah at their kitchen table. They ate homemade soup and bread, and Sarah asked Francis about his life, about his dreams, about what he liked to do. Francis found himself talking more than he had in years. He told them about his parents, about the fire, about living on the streets. He told them about meeting Mrs. Helen on her birthday, and how she had changed his life. She was a remarkable woman, Edward said. And she saw something special in you, Francis. She told me that you reminded her of herself when she was young, poor but determined, struggling but hopeful. Do you really think they'll try to fight the will? Francis asked nervously. Edward sighed. Yes, I do. They'll probably claim that Mrs. Helen wasn't thinking clearly because of her illness. They'll say you manipulated her or tricked her. They'll do everything they can to break the will. Will they win? Francis asked, his heart sinking. No, Edward said firmly. I made absolutely sure that will was airtight. I had Mrs. Helen evaluated by 2 different doctors who both confirmed she was completely mentally competent. I had everything recorded and witnessed properly. I followed every single law to the letter. They can try to fight it, but they will lose. How long will it take? Frances asked. Could be months, Edward said honestly. Maybe even a year or more if they drag it through the courts. But in the end, justice will prevail. Mrs. Helen's wishes will be honored. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Frances's hand. And until then you have a home here with us. You're not alone anymore, Frances. Frances felt tears in his eyes again. These people barely knew him, but they were being so kind. Just like Mrs. Helen had been kind. The next 3 days passed slowly. Frances stayed mostly in his room, reading books that Sarah gave him and thinking about Mrs. Helen. He was scared about the funeral. Scared about seeing Janet, Jacob, and Vivian again. Scared about what would happen at the reading of the will. On the morning of the funeral, Sarah helped Frances get dressed in a suit that Edward had bought for him. It was simple and black, appropriate for a funeral. Frances looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized himself. He looked like a normal boy now, not a street kid. Mrs. Helen would be so proud to see you looking so handsome, Sarah said with a sad smile. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Church, a beautiful old building with stained glass windows. When Frances arrived with Edward and Sarah, the church was already half full of people. Business associates of Mrs. Helen's. Neighbors. People from charities she had supported. And sitting in the front row were Janet, Jacob, and Vivian, all dressed in expensive black clothes, all looking properly sad. Frances sat in the back with Edward and Sarah. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He didn't want to cause any trouble. The service began. A pastor spoke about Mrs. Helen's life, her generosity, her business success, her charitable work. People came forward to share memories of her kindness. But Frances noticed that Janet, Jacob, and Vivian didn't say anything. They sat there looking sad, but they didn't speak about their mother. They didn't share any stories. They didn't tell anyone how much they loved her. Frances wanted to stand up. He wanted to tell everyone the truth, that Mrs. Helen had been lonely and neglected by her family. That she had spent her last birthday alone until a street boy showed up. That her own children had thrown that boy out and made her cry. But Edward had told him to stay quiet, so he did. After the service, everyone went to the cemetery. It was a gray, cloudy day. The wind blew through the trees as Mrs. Helen's casket was lowered into the ground. Frances stood far back from the grave, crying quietly. He watched as people threw flowers onto the casket. He watched as Janet, Jacob, and Vivian stood by the grave, looking solemn but not really crying. When most people had left, Frances walked slowly to the grave. He knelt down and placed his hand on the freshly turned earth. "Thank you, Mrs. Helen," he whispered. "Thank you for everything. I promise I'll make you proud. I promise I'll help other kids like me. I promise I'll never forget you." He stood up and wiped his tears. When he turned around, he saw Janet, Jacob, and Vivian staring at him from across the cemetery. Their faces were hard and cold. Frances felt a shiver run down his spine. Tomorrow was the reading of the will. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. That night, Frances could barely sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, thinking about what would happen tomorrow. Edward had explained that the reading of the will would take place in his office at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Everyone mentioned in the will had to be there. Frances kept imagining Janet and Jacob's faces when they found out. Would they yell? Would they try to hurt him? Would they call him a liar and a thief? "You'll be fine," Edward had told him earlier that evening. "I'll be right there with you. And remember, the law is on your side." But Frances didn't feel fine. He felt scared and small and alone, even though Sarah and Edward were just down the hall. Finally, morning came. Frances got dressed in the same suit he had worn to the funeral. He could barely eat the breakfast Sarah made for him. His stomach was twisted in knots. "It's going to be okay," Sarah said gently, seeing how nervous he was. Mrs. Helen knew what she was doing. She wanted you to have a better life, and that's exactly what's going to happen. At 1:30, Edward, Sarah, and Frances drove to Edward's office. It was in the blue building on Oak Street, just like Mrs. Helen had told Frances. The building looked professional and serious, with big glass windows and a marble lobby. Edward's office was on the 3rd floor. It was a large room with wooden furniture, shelves full of law books, and a big desk. There was a conference table in the middle with several chairs around it. "They'll be here soon," Edward said, checking his watch. "Frances, I want you to sit right here next to me. Sarah will sit on your other side. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, you stay calm and quiet. Let me do all the talking." Understood. Yes, sir, Francis said, his voice barely above a whisper. At exactly 2 o'clock there was a knock on the door. Edward's secretary opened it, and in walked Janet, Jacob, and Vivian. They all stopped when they saw Francis sitting at the table. What is he doing here? Jacob demanded immediately. Francis is here because he is mentioned in Mrs. Helen's will, Edward said calmly. Please sit down. We have a lot to discuss. Mentioned in the will? Janet said, her voice sharp. Mention how? Did Mother leave him a few $100s or something? Please sit down, Edward repeated. All will be explained. Reluctantly, Janet, Jacob, and Vivian sat down on the opposite side of the table from Francis. They stared at him like wolves staring at a rabbit. Edward opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. This is the last will and testament of Christian Helen, signed and witnessed on August 15th of this year, just 3 weeks before her passing. 3 weeks ago? Jacob said, sitting up straight. Wait, she changed her will 3 weeks ago? Yes, Edward said. Mrs. Helen called me and asked to revise her will. She was completely of sound mind, as verified by 2 independent doctors. Everything was done legally and properly. Janet and Jacob exchanged worried glances. Before I read the will, Edward continued, I want to remind everyone here that this document is legally binding. It was created according to Mrs. Helen's wishes, and it will be honored. Any attempts to contest it will be met with the full force of the law. Just read it, Vivian said impatiently. We want to know what Helen left us. Edward adjusted his glasses and began to read. I, Christian Helen, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He read through the legal language about funeral arrangements and final expenses. Then he got to the important part. To my sister Vivian, I leave the sum of $5,000, with the hope that she will use it wisely. Vivian's face turned red. $5,000? That's it? After everything I did for her? What did you do for her? Francis couldn't help but say. You only called when you needed money. You shut your mouth. Vivian hissed. Please, Edward said firmly. Let me continue. He went back to the document. To my daughter, Janet, and my son, Jacob, I leave the sum of $10,000 each. The room went completely silent. Janet's mouth fell open. 10,000? That's only 20,000 total. That can't be right, Jacob said, his voice rising. Mother was worth millions. Where's the rest of it going? Edward continued reading, his voice steady and professional. I have watched my children grow from loving, innocent young people into adults who value money more than family. They have shown me through their actions that they do not love me, they love what I can give them. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience leave my life's work to people who will squander it and use it selfishly. This is insane. Jacob shouted, jumping to his feet. She was sick. She wasn't thinking clearly. Sit down, Mr. Jacob, Edward said firmly. I have medical documentation from 2 doctors stating that your mother was completely mentally competent when she signed this will. If you interrupt again, I will have security remove you from this office. Jacob sat down slowly, his face purple with rage. Edward continued. Instead, I leave the entirety of my estate, including my home, my business, all bank accounts, investments and properties, to Francis, the young boy who showed me more kindness in a few weeks than my own family showed me in years. The room exploded. No. Janet screamed, standing up so fast her chair fell over. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. That street kid gets everything? Jacob roared. Our mother's entire fortune goes to some homeless beggar? He tricked her. Vivian shouted. He manipulated a sick old woman. This will is fraud. Sit down. Edward commanded, his voice booming through the office. All of you sit down now or this meeting is over. They sat down slowly, all 3 of them shaking with fury. Edward continued reading. I know my children will contest this will. I know they will say terrible things about Francis and about me. But I want it known that this decision was made with complete clarity and purpose. Francis reminded me what real love looks like. He asked for nothing and gave everything. He is everything I hoped my children would be but never were. Janet was crying now, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and humiliation. Furthermore, Edward read, I have instructed my lawyer, Edward Miller, to adopt Francis legally and serve as his guardian until he reaches adulthood. Edward will manage the estate and ensure that Francis receives a proper education and upbringing. Francis is instructed to use this inheritance to better himself, to help others, and to continue the charitable work I began. Francis felt like he couldn't breathe. Mrs. Helen wanted Edward to adopt him? To be his guardian? He looked at Edward in shock. Edward smiled gently at him. "We'll talk about that part later," he said quietly. Then Edward read the final paragraph. "To my children I say this, I loved you with all my heart. I gave you everything I could. But you never learned the most important lesson, that love and family are worth more than money. I hope that losing this inheritance will teach you what I could not. I pray that someday you will understand why I made this choice. Your loving mother, Christian Helen." Edward closed the document and looked up at Janet, Jacob, and Vivian. That concludes the reading of the will. For a moment nobody spoke. The silence was heavy and terrible. Then Jacob stood up slowly, his face twisted with hatred. He pointed at Francis. "You did this. You poisoned our mother's mind against us. You're a thief and a con artist." "I didn't do anything," Francis said, his voice shaking. I just helped her. I just kept her company." "You stole our inheritance," Janet shrieked. "You stole what was rightfully ours." "It was never yours," Edward said coldly. "It was your mother's. And she had every right to leave it to whomever she chose. The will is legal and binding." "We'll fight this," Jacob said, his voice dangerous and low. "We'll take this to court. We'll get the best lawyers money can buy. We will destroy this will and we will destroy that boy." "You can try," Edward said calmly. "But you will lose. I've been a lawyer for 30 years, and I made absolutely certain this will cannot be broken. You can waste your money on lawyers if you want, but the outcome will be the same." Vivian stood up, her eyes filled with tears of anger. "Helen was my sister. My only sister. And she left me nothing but $5,000 and gave everything to a stranger." "She gave you exactly what you deserved," Sarah said quietly from beside Francis. She had been silent until now, but she couldn't stay quiet anymore. Mrs. Helen told Edward everything. How you only called when you needed money. How you never paid back your loans. How you were jealous of her success. You broke her heart, all of you. "How dare you?" Vivian spat. "This meeting is over," Edward said, standing up. "You all know the contents of the will. If you wish to contest it, you'll need to file the proper legal paperwork. But I'm telling you now, you're wasting your time and money." Janet leaned across the table, staring at Francis with pure hatred. "This isn't over, boy. We will make your life miserable. We will fight you for every single penny. You will regret the day you ever met our mother." "Are you threatening a child?" Edward said, his voice cold as ice. "Because if you are, I'll have no choice but to report you to the police." Janet straightened up but kept her eyes fixed on Francis. "I'm just stating facts. We will see you in court." "Fine," Edward said. "My office will be ready. Now please leave." Jacob stood up and kicked his chair, sending it crashing against the wall. "This is the biggest mistake of your life, kid. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Out. Now," Edward commanded, pointing to the door. One by one, Janet, Jacob, and Vivian left the office. But as Vivian reached the door, she turned back one last time. "My sister would be ashamed of what she did. Choosing a stranger over her own family." "Your sister," Sarah said quietly but firmly, "made the bravest and most honest decision of her life. She chose character over blood, love over obligation. And she died knowing she did the right thing." Vivian's face crumpled and she rushed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. The room was silent for a long moment. Francis sat frozen in his chair, unable to believe what had just happened. Everything Mrs. Helen owned, the mansion, the business, the money, it all belonged to him now. A boy who had been sleeping on streets just weeks ago. "Francis," Edward said gently. "Are you okay?" Francis looked up at him, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know what to feel. I'm happy because Mrs. Helen wanted me to have this. But I'm scared because they hate me so much. And I'm sad because she's gone and I can't thank her." Sarah came around the table and hugged Francis tightly. "Oh, sweetheart. It's okay to feel all of those things at once. They're going to fight this, aren't they?" Francis asked. "They're going to try to take it all away?" "Yes, they will try," Edward said honestly. "Tomorrow they'll probably hire lawyers. They'll file a lawsuit claiming your mother was mentally incompetent or that you manipulated her. They'll drag this through the courts for months, maybe even a year." "Will they win?" Francis asked, his voice small. Edward sat down next to Francis and looked him directly in the eyes. "No, Francis. They will not win. I promise you that. Mrs. Helen and I prepared for this. We knew exactly what her children would do, and we made sure the will was absolutely unbreakable." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. I have video recordings of Mrs. Helen stating her wishes in her own words. I have written statements from her doctors. I have testimony from witnesses who saw how her children treated her. And most importantly, I have the fact that Mrs. Helen was a brilliant, successful businesswoman who knew exactly what she was doing. But what if, Frances started. No what ifs, Edward said firmly but kindly. Listen to me, Frances. I have been a lawyer for 32 years. I have handled hundreds of wills and estates. And I am telling you, this will is rock solid. Janet and Jacob can hire the best lawyers in the country, and they will still lose. What happens now? Frances asked. Now, Edward said, we wait. They'll file their lawsuit probably within the next week. Then we'll go to court, present our evidence, and the judge will rule in our favor. It might take 6 months. It might take a year. But in the end, Mrs. Helen's wishes will be honored. And what about me? Frances asked. Where do I live? What do I do? Edward smiled. Well, that's the other part of Mrs. Helen's will. She asked me to become your legal guardian. To adopt you and raise you as my own son. Frances's eyes went wide. Really? You would do that? We would be honored to do that, Sarah said, smiling through her tears. Edward and I never had children of our own. We always wanted to, but it just never happened. And now it feels like God sent you to us. We would love to have you as part of our family, Frances. If you'll have us. Frances couldn't hold back his tears anymore. He cried and cried, but this time they were tears of joy and relief. Yes, he sobbed. Yes, I want that. I want a family again. Sarah and Edward both hugged him, and for the first time since his parents died in that fire 3 years ago, Frances felt like he had a home. Over the next few months, everything happened just as Edward predicted. Janet and Jacob hired expensive lawyers and filed a lawsuit. They claimed Mrs. Helen had been mentally incompetent due to her illness. They claimed Frances had manipulated and tricked her. They even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Frances, hoping to find something they could use against him. But there was nothing to find. Frances was exactly who he appeared to be, a good kid who had suffered bad luck and found kindness from a dying woman. The case went to court. Frances had to testify, which was scary. Janet and Jacob's lawyers asked him hard questions, trying to make him look bad. But Frances told the truth. He explained how he had met Mrs. Helen on her birthday, how she had invited him in, how they had become friends, how he had taken care of her when she was sick. Then Edward presented his evidence. The video of Mrs. Helen explaining her decision in her own words. The medical reports proving she was mentally sound. Testimony from Mrs. Anderson, the cook, who confirmed that Frances had indeed cared for Mrs. Helen every day. But the most powerful moment came when Edward played a recording that Mrs. Helen had made just a week before she died. The courtroom went silent as her weak but clear voice filled the room. My name is Christian Helen. I am making this recording of my own free will, while I am of sound mind. I want everyone to know that I am leaving my estate to Frances because he deserves it. My children stopped being my children a long time ago. They became strangers who only wanted my money. But Frances showed me pure, unconditional love. He asked for nothing and gave everything. If my children contest this will, it will only prove that I was right about them. They care more about money than they ever cared about me. Frances, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. But I want you to know, you were the best gift I received in my final days. You reminded me why I worked so hard all my life. Not for money but to make a difference. Now it's your turn. Use this gift wisely. Help others the way you help me. And remember, you are loved. When the recording ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge wiped tears from his eyes. Janet and Jacob sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale. For the first time, they truly heard their mother's words. They heard how much pain they had caused her. They heard how much they had failed her. 2 days later, the judge made his ruling. After carefully reviewing all the evidence, he said, I find that Christian Helen was absolutely of sound mind when she created her will. There is no evidence of manipulation or coercion. Her decision to leave her estate to Frances was made freely and deliberately. Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendant. The will stands as written. Janet and Jacob's lawsuit was dismissed. They had lost. Everything their mother owned now legally belonged to Frances. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked directly at Janet and Jacob. I want to say something to the plaintiffs. Your mother left you a far more valuable gift than money. She left you a lesson. She showed you that love and kindness matter more than wealth. I suggest you take that lesson to heart. Case dismissed. Frances sat between Edward and Sarah, unable to believe it was really over. He had won. Mrs. Helen's wishes had been honored. As they left the courthouse, Francis saw Janet and Jacob standing by their car. For a moment he thought they might yell at him or threaten him again. But they didn't. They just stood there looking defeated and lost. Francis surprised everyone, including himself, by walking over to them. "I'm sorry," Francis said quietly. "I'm sorry you lost your mother. And I'm sorry you lost the inheritance. But Mrs. Helen, she wasn't trying to punish you. She was trying to teach you something." "Teach us what?" Janet said bitterly. "That we're terrible people?" "No," Francis said. "That money isn't everything. That family means being there for people. That love matters more than stuff." He paused. "Mrs. Helen told me she loved you until the very end. She just wished you had loved her back the same way." Jacob looked away, his jaw clenched. But Francis saw tears in his eyes. "I'm going to use this money the way she wanted," Francis continued. "I'm going to help other kids like me. Kids who are alone and scared and hungry. And if you ever want to help too, you can." Mrs. Helen would have liked that. He turned and walked back to Edward and Sarah, leaving Janet and Jacob standing in silence. Years passed. Francis lived with Edward and Sarah, who officially adopted him. He went back to school and discovered he was incredibly smart, just like Mrs. Helen had said he was. He got straight A's and eventually got a scholarship to college. When he turned 18, Francis gained full control of Mrs. Helen's estate. The first thing he did was set up a foundation called Helen's Hope to help homeless children. The foundation provided food, shelter, education, and support to kids who had nowhere else to go. Francis also kept Mrs. Helen's furniture business running, but he changed it. He hired people who had been homeless or in trouble, giving them second chances just like Mrs. Helen had given him. He never forgot Mrs. Helen's kindness. Every year on her birthday, Francis visited her grave. He brought fresh flowers and told her about all the children he had helped. He told her about the businesses he had started. He told her about the lives he had changed. "I kept my promise, Mrs. Helen," he would say. "I made you proud." And in a surprising twist, 2 years after the court case, Francis received a letter. It was from Janet. "Dear Francis," it read. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness for how I treated you and my mother. But I wanted you to know, you were right. Mother was trying to teach us something, and it took me losing everything to finally understand. I've been volunteering at a homeless shelter for the past year. It doesn't make up for anything, but it's a start. Thank you for showing me what real kindness looks like. Janet." Francis wrote back, inviting her to volunteer with Helen's Hope. Janet accepted. She never got the money back, but she got something better. She got a purpose. Jacob never apologized. He spent years being angry and bitter. But eventually even he came around. On the 10th anniversary of Mrs. Helen's death, he showed up at her grave where Francis was visiting. "I was a terrible son," Jacob said simply. "And you were a better son to her than I ever was, even though you weren't related by blood. I wanted you to know that I finally understand why she chose you." Francis shook his hand. "She never stopped loving you, you know. She just wanted you to learn what really matters." On the 20th anniversary of Mrs. Helen's death, Francis stood before a crowd of 500 people. They were gathered for the opening of a new children's home, the largest Helen's Hope had ever built. Francis, now 31 years old, successful and respected, stood at the podium and told the story. He told them about being a hungry 11-year-old boy who knocked on a rich woman's door. He told them about the birthday celebration that changed his life. He told them about kindness and love and second chances. "Mrs. Helen taught me that family isn't about blood," Francis said, his voice strong and clear. "Family is about who shows up, who cares, who loves you when you need it most. She showed up for me when I had nothing and no one. And now, through this foundation, we show up for children who need someone to believe in them." The crowd applauded. Among them sat Edward and Sarah, now in their 70s, beaming with pride at the man Francis had become. Also in the crowd was Janet, who now ran one of Helen's Hope's biggest programs. She had truly changed, dedicating her life to helping others instead of herself. Even Jacob was there, sitting quietly in the back. He had donated a large sum of his own money to the children's home, trying in his own way to honor the mother he had failed. That night, Francis returned to Mrs. Helen's grave one more time. It was a beautiful evening with stars filling the sky. He knelt down and placed his hand on the headstone. "We did it, Mrs. Helen," he said softly. "You gave me a chance when I had nothing. You believed in me when no one else did. You loved me when I was alone. And because of you, hundreds of other kids now have what you gave me, hope. A gentle breeze blew through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on the trees. And in that moment, Francis felt a warmth in his heart, as if Mrs. Helen was there with him, smiling. "Thank you," Francis whispered. "Thank you for everything. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for teaching me that dreams really do come true." He stood up and looked at the stars, thinking about all the children currently sleeping in safe beds at Helen's Hope facilities. Children who had been hungry and scared, just like he once was. Children who now had food, shelter, education, and most importantly, people who cared about them. Mrs. Helen's legacy lived on. Not in mansions or money, but in the lives she had touched and the love she had shown. And Francis, the street boy who became a millionaire, never forgot the most important lesson she taught him. True wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in kindness, in love, and in the lives you change for the better. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.